At around 6 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of March 2001, a 999 call was made from a large house behind electric gates in the Essex village of Roydon. There was a man in the swimming pool. He wasn't moving. By the time the paramedics reached him, Stuart Lubbock was 31 years old, a father of two, a butcher by trade, and completely unresponsive. He had been at that house for a matter of hours. He had never met most of the people there, and he had certainly never expected to spend the night at the home of one of the most famous men in Britain. He was pronounced dead a short time later at Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow. And the man who owned that swimming pool, the man whose name was about to be attached to that death forever, was Michael Barrymore, a light entertainment titan, peak time royalty. Somewhere in the region of 14 million viewers on a Saturday night, the kind of household name that didn't need a surname. Within 24 hours, his career was finished. Within a week, his face was on every front page in the country. Not as an entertainer, as a question. And more than 2 decades later, that question still hasn't been answered. Nobody has ever been charged. Nobody has ever been convicted. And what actually happened in the last hour of Stuart Lubbock's life remains officially unknown. This is the story of how Britain's most loved entertainer became its most avoided man, and of a father who spent the rest of his own life trying to find out why his son died. To understand the size of the fall, you have to understand the size of the height. Michael Barrymore, born Michael Ciaran Parker in Bermondsey, South London, in 1952, did not arrive fully formed. He came up the hard, unglamorous way: holiday camps, working men's clubs, Butlins, the endless circuit of rooms where an audience will happily talk over you if you aren't funny within the first 15 seconds. That apprenticeship gave him something you cannot manufacture in a studio. He learned to read a room instantly, and he learned that the most reliable laugh in British entertainment isn't a joke at all. It's a real person caught off guard, being themselves. His childhood was not comfortable. He has spoken publicly about growing up with an alcoholic father who left the family, and about the kind of instability that tends to produce either a very quiet adult or a very loud one. Barrymore became loud, relentlessly, brilliantly loud. By the mid-1980s, he had a new name, a manager, and a wife, Cheryl Sinclair, who he married in 1976, and who would go on to co-manage his career with something close to ferocity. And then came the format that made him. Strike It Lucky launched on ITV in 1986. On paper, it was almost nothing. Contestants, a wall of television screens, a game simple enough for a child to follow, hotspots, prizes, a bit of luck. In the hands of almost any other host, it would have been forgotten within a season. Barrymore turned it into an institution. He didn't present the show, he demolished it and rebuilt it every single week around whoever happened to be standing next to him. He'd abandon the script entirely. He'd wander off into the audience. He'd get a contestant talking about their job, their marriage, their bad back. And then he'd let the whole thing collapse into chaos and somehow land it, every time, on a note of genuine affection. That was the trick. The comedy was never cruel. It was conspiratorial. You weren't laughing at the plumber from Doncaster. You were laughing with him. Because Barrymore had decided that the plumber from Doncaster was the star and that he himself was merely the support act. It worked. It worked enormously. Barrymore, My Kind of People, a travelling talent show in shopping centres, which was essentially one man alone in a crowd improvising for an hour. Kids say the funniest things, strike it rich. He collected national television awards. He was routinely described as the highest-paid entertainer on British television. In 1995, he was voted the country's most popular TV personality. He was not a niche taste, he was a fixture. The sound of Saturday tea time in millions of British homes, the man your grandmother genuinely adored, sitting in the exact centre of the national living room, and behind all of it, he was coming apart. Here is the part of the story that the tabloids of the era treated as scandal, and which we should treat as what it actually was: a man in serious distress, in an industry and an era with no vocabulary for it. Barrymore has spoken openly for decades now about alcoholism and drug use running directly alongside the peak of his fame. The public saw a man who never stopped talking. Privately, the drinking was escalating. In 1995, at a nightclub in Stoke Newington, he took a microphone and told the room he was gay. By any reasonable measure, that was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. A mainstream family entertainer at the absolute summit of his commercial value in mid-90s Britain, with a tabloid press that treated such a revelation as blood in the water. The fallout was brutal, and it was public. His marriage to Cheryl ended. They divorced in 1997. She had been not just his wife, but the architect of much of his professional life, and the separation was fought out in the newspapers rather than in private. What followed was several years of a very particular kind of British spectacle: the slow-motion tabloid dismantling of a beloved figure. Stories about his private life, stories about the drinking, photographs taken at the worst possible moment, treatment programs, relapses, and the grim understanding that his personal collapse was now content. And yet, and this matters, the work was still there. In early 2001, he was still an ITV name. Still bankable, still, in principle, recoverable. Careers in light entertainment have survived far worse than a messy divorce and a stint in rehab. He was 48 years old. He had a large house in Essex with a swimming pool and a hot tub. He had a future. He had about 4 weeks left of it. Friday, the 30th of March, 2001. An ordinary night out in Harlow, Essex. Stuart Lubbock was 31. He worked as a butcher. He was a father of 2 young children. By every account given by the people who knew him, he was an unremarkable, decent, sociable bloke on a normal night out with friends. Exactly the kind of person whose name should never have become nationally known. He was at a nightclub called Millenniums in Harlow. And at some point that night, he and a small group ended up being invited back to a house party. Not just any house, Michael Barrymore's house on Beaumont Park Drive in Roydon, a substantial property behind gates with a swimming pool and a hot tub in the garden. Think about that from Stuart's point of view for a second. You're out on a Friday night in Essex, and you end up, in the early hours of the morning, standing in the garden of a man you have watched on television your entire adult life. The group arrived in the small hours of Saturday morning. There were, by the accounts that later emerged, around 8 people at the house. What happened over the next few hours has since been the subject of an inquest, 2 separate police investigations, a civil claim, a media circus, and more than 20 years of speculation. And it has never been established to any legal standard. What is documented is this: there was drinking, there were drugs, and at some point people were in the pool, and then at around 5:45 in the morning, Stuart Lubbock was found in the water. This is where the story turns from a tragedy into something far darker. And it's the reason it never went away. The post-mortem examination found alcohol in Stuart Lubbock's system, along with ecstasy and cocaine. On its own, that would have been a grim but comprehensible story. A young man, a heavy night, a swimming pool, a catastrophic accident. Britain has that story every summer, but the examination also recorded severe internal injuries consistent with a serious sexual assault, that single finding transformed everything. Because a drowning is a tragedy. But a drowning preceded by a violent assault in a private garden in front of a handful of people is potentially a crime scene. And every single person who had been at that house suddenly became a person with something to explain. And here is where the case begins to fall apart, before it has even properly begun. The scene was not secured as a crime scene at the outset. By the time the possibility of a serious sexual assault was on the table, people had left. Accounts conflicted. Physical evidence that might have existed in and around the pool and the house was, in the view of Stuart's family and their supporters, irretrievably compromised. And then there was the matter of the missing thermometer, a pool thermometer that was said to have been at the property that night, and which was never recovered. Over the years it became one of the great grim symbols of this case, an object that might have mattered enormously or might have mattered not at all, and which nobody can now produce. Essex police would face sustained criticism over the handling of those first few hours. The force has, in later years, acknowledged shortcomings in the original response, but criticism doesn't recover evidence. Once those first hours were gone, they were gone forever. The news broke almost immediately, and it broke in the worst possible configuration for a family entertainer: a dead man, a swimming pool, Class A drugs, and a nationally beloved name attached to all three. Barrymore had left the property before police arrived. That detail alone, reported and re-reported for weeks, became a permanent stain, regardless of what it actually signified. In the days that followed, he was arrested on suspicion of drugs offences, and later received a caution relating to the supply of a controlled drug. In the wider context of a man's death, it looked almost absurdly minor. In the context of a Saturday night family show, it was terminal. ITV, which had built entire schedules around him, moved with the speed of an organisation that has already done the maths. Programmes were pulled, contracts were not renewed. The most bankable entertainer on British television became, essentially overnight, unbookable. And the reason was not a verdict. There was no verdict. The reason was association. That is the specific cruelty at the heart of this whole story. Michael Barrymore was never charged with causing Stuart Lubbock's death. But in the public imagination, those two names fused permanently, and no court, no inquest, no police statement was ever able to separate them again. He would later describe the period that followed in stark terms. The drinking, the collapse. The sense that the person the public had loved simply no longer existed. He left the country for a period living in New Zealand. The man who had built an entire career out of walking into a crowd of strangers and being adored could no longer walk into a crowd at all. In September 2002, the inquest into Stuart Lubbock's death was held. An inquest is not a trial. It doesn't assign blame, and it doesn't assign guilt. Its job is narrower, and for a grieving family, often maddening. It exists to establish who died, and where, when, and how. The coroner heard the medical evidence, the drugs, the alcohol, the internal injuries, the conflicting accounts of who had been where and when in the garden of that house. And the inquest returned an open verdict. An open verdict means the evidence was insufficient to reach any other conclusion. Not accident, not misadventure, not unlawful killing, not suicide. Simply this: we cannot say. For Terry Lubbock, Stuart's father, that was not an ending. It was the beginning of the rest of his life. If this story has a hero, it is not a detective, and it is certainly not a celebrity. Terry Lubbock was a retired man from Essex who had lost his son, and who had just been told, in effect, that the state could not tell him how. So he decided to do it himself. For 20 years, he learned the language of pathology reports. He gave interviews to anyone who would listen. National newspapers, local radio, documentary crews, podcasters. He campaigned, he wrote, he turned up. He kept his son's name in the public record at a time when every institutional force in this story would have found it far more convenient for that name to quietly fade away. He was not, by his own admission, much interested in nuance about Barrymore's suffering. He wanted one thing. He wanted somebody to tell him what had happened to Stuart in that garden. And he never got it. Terry Lubbock died in 2021 without an answer. 20 years of campaigning, and the case was still sitting exactly where the coroner had left it. Open. Before he died, he passed the campaign on. His family and the private investigators and journalists he had drawn into the case carried it forward. Whatever else this story is, it is not really a story about a celebrity. It is a story about a man who died at 31, and a father who refused to let that be the end of it. 6 years after the death, the case came violently back to life. In June 2007, Essex police arrested Michael Barrymore and 2 other men on suspicion of the sexual assault and murder of Stuart Lubbock. For the family, this was the moment. For the press, it was a second front-page cycle. And for Barrymore, it was the definitive end of any hope of a quiet rehabilitation. And then, nothing. All 3 men were released. No charges were brought. The Crown Prosecution Service, applying the same test it applies to every case, concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute anyone. Listen carefully to that phrase, because it's the sentence this entire story keeps returning to. Insufficient evidence is not the same thing as innocence, and it is not the same thing as guilt. It is the legal system saying we cannot prove what happened here. Barrymore has consistently and firmly denied any responsibility for Stuart Lubbock's death, and no court has ever found otherwise. Years later, that arrest produced its own extraordinary legal aftermath. Barrymore sued Essex police, arguing the arrest had been unlawful. The courts ultimately found that it had been. But in 2018, the Court of Appeal ruled that he was entitled to only nominal damages on the basis that a lawful arrest could have been made in any event. So the final legal word on that chapter was, in its own way, perfectly emblematic of the whole case. Everyone was partly right, nobody was vindicated, and nothing was resolved. 20 years on, in 2021, the case opened one final time. Essex police announced a fresh appeal around the 20th anniversary, offering a substantial reward for information. The force said it was pursuing new lines of inquiry, including information from a witness who had come forward. A man in his 50s was arrested on suspicion of indecent assault and murder, and for a few weeks it genuinely looked as though this thing might finally break. 2 decades of campaigning, a father who had only just died without his answer, a new witness, an arrest. And then in August 2021, the police announced that no charges would be brought. The man was released, and the reason given was the same reason that had been given back in 2007 in almost exactly the same words. Insufficient evidence. That was effectively the end. The scene had been lost in 2001. The accounts had hardened over 20 years. Memories had degraded. Witnesses had died, including Terry Lubbock himself. Whatever the pool and the house might once have been able to prove, they could not prove it now. Stuart Lubbock died in 2001. To this day, nobody has ever been charged with causing his death. And Barrymore, he tried, repeatedly. There were attempts at a return, reality television, a well-received appearance on Celebrity Big Brother, stage work, tours, interviews in which he spoke with disarming honesty about addiction, about grief, and about the very specific horror of being a suspect in the public mind rather than in a courtroom. But the arithmetic of British light entertainment is unforgiving. To host a Saturday night family show, you need to be a person the entire family can look at without thinking about anything else. And for millions of people, the name Michael Barrymore now arrived preloaded with the image of a swimming pool in Essex. He was cleared of nothing, because he was accused of nothing. That sounds like a technicality. In practice, it was a life sentence, the worst of both worlds. There was never a trial to lose, and therefore there was never a trial to win. No moment of exoneration, ever, at all. One of the biggest stars British television has ever produced simply stopped being a star. And there was no verdict anywhere to explain why, so let's separate cleanly what is established from what is not. Because this case has spent more than 20 years buried under speculation, and the family deserves better than that. Here is what is documented. Stuart Lubbock, aged 31, was found unresponsive in the swimming pool at Michael Barrymore's home in Roydon, Essex, in the early hours of the 31st of March 2001, and died shortly afterwards. The post-mortem found alcohol, ecstasy and cocaine in his system, along with severe internal injuries consistent with a serious sexual assault. The 2002 inquest returned an open verdict. Barrymore was arrested and cautioned in 2001 over a drugs matter, and his television career ended within weeks. In 2007, Barrymore and 2 other men were arrested on suspicion of sexual assault and murder, and all 3 were released without charge. The courts later found that arrest unlawful, with the Court of Appeal awarding only nominal damages in 2018. In 2021, the case was reopened, a man was arrested, and in August of that year, police confirmed no charges would follow due to insufficient evidence. Essex police have faced sustained criticism over the handling of the original scene, and Terry Lubbock campaigned for 20 years and died without an answer. And here is what is not established and what nobody should be asserting. Who caused Stuart Lubbock's injuries? Whether he entered the water alive or unconscious. Whether his death was an accident, a misadventure, or an unlawful killing. And what became of that missing pool thermometer? Everything beyond that first list is inference. Some of it may well be correct. None of it has ever been proven. There's a version of this story that is only about a famous man losing everything. It's the easier version, and it's the one that sold newspapers for 20 years. But the harder version is the true one, and it's this. A 31-year-old butcher from Essex went out on a Friday night, got invited somewhere extraordinary, and never came home to his 2 children. He was seriously injured before he died, and somebody in that garden knows something. And the country's response was to spend the next 2 decades talking almost exclusively about the man who owned the pool. That is the double tragedy at the center of this case. Michael Barrymore lost a career to an accusation that was never formally made and never tested in court. Stuart Lubbock lost his life to something that has never been named, and Terry Lubbock spent every year he had left asking one single question that the British state, with all of its resources, could not answer. A quarter of a century on, the house has changed hands. The pool is long gone. The witnesses have scattered, and some of them have died. And somewhere out there, in all likelihood, at least one person still remembers exactly what happened in those last few minutes before 6 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of March, 2001. And they've had 25 years to say it. So far, they haven't.